Thank you. You're all in for a wonderful treat. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I usually don't have any problem with that, do I?
It is now.
Who said? You are in for a very special experience this afternoon. I want to welcome you all back from spring break. If you didn't learn how to do it during spring break, we'll now explain to you how to become evil. All right, let's put the levity aside.
Was that a joke?
I was very serious. Someone who has become a vital part of this series is Jim Waller. I think it's been at least 4 years and perhaps 5 that he's come back to talk to students, explaining the research that he did, the impassioned research he did on trying to understand how normal or ordinary people can commit awful and inhumane acts. Dr. Waller is a Holocaust scholar of the first rank. He is associated with the Auschwitz Institute. Oh, you changed? The Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. They hold seminars there 3 times a year to talk about the lessons that need to be learned about what went on in that place. And those of us who know Jim are very, very thrilled to have found out that he has accepted a position as an endowed chair of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State University in New Hampshire. And I can't think of a better person to do that, and I'm just thrilled. So for the past 4 or 5 years, Jim and his wife Patty come down from Spokane, Washington to get out of the rain and come to the rain. I think, you know, we planned it for April this year, so it might be sunny, but we are getting some sun. Okay. So, without any further introduction, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. James Waller.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay in the back if I'm out here? That's fine? Good. Welcome back. You had spring break last week? That's what it's been back for. Wow. Great. Well, welcome back. Let me tell you a little bit about what we'll do today over the next hour or so, and at the end, we'll have time for any questions you might have as well about the presentation or things I left unsaid or to some degree my work with the Auschwitz Institute. But what I want to do with you for about an hour is talk a little bit about the question of perpetrators of genocide, the men and occasionally women who carry out the atrocities that we see in genocide and mass killing, and ask some fundamental questions about who these people are, how they come to be, and what that says about you and I and our place in this world as well. And I think that what I want to do is begin by putting the discussion in the broadest context possible, and to go even more broadly than typically we might do by talking about genocide, and to talk about human conflict throughout history. And we'll do that with this slide. This is a picture on the left-hand side that many of you will recognize from the Jewish scriptures and the Christian Old Testament. It's the story of Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel are the 2 sons of Adam and Eve, the world's first family according to the Christian Jewish tradition. And growing up the son of ministers, I knew this story for as long as I knew stories. But it probably wasn't until about 2000, 2001 when I was working on the first draft of Becoming Evil that the significance of the story really hit me. And that is that here we have 2 people, 2 brothers, in a world in the Christian Jewish tradition in which death has not entered the world yet. And if you think about these 2 traditions, and whether you're Christian, whether you're Jewish or not, these 2 traditions have influenced a large part of how we think about ourselves in the Western world. But if you think about how might death first make its appearance in the world, famine, pestilence, plague, heart attack, the most common way, accident. But here are two men, says Elie Wiesel, the most widely read writer on the Holocaust. Two men, and one of them became a killer. This is a powerful story. And these two traditions, Christian Jewish traditions, the first time death makes its appearance in the world, it comes in the form of murder. And I think in many ways, when you study conflict, whether it's genocide, whether it's war, whether it's intergroup or interpersonal conflict, this really forms an important context for how the West has thought about conflict for the longest part of its history and its understanding. Two men, and one of them become a killer. Now we can jump forward several centuries, and you'll see some data points here about kind of the ubiquity, the constant presence of warfare in human history. Rather than go through those points, which you can see here, let me share with you 3 quotes I think about when I see this slide. The first quote comes from Trotsky, and Trotsky says this: "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." And I love that quote because you could be sitting here today saying, I don't want anything to do with war. I know my country's at war in 2 fronts, in Iraq, Afghanistan. I know people close to me that have been touched by it, but I just don't want to have anything to do with it. You have that choice to some degree, but you also really don't have that choice. Even if you're not interested in war, war is incredibly interested in you. Most of you here today have probably lived over half your life at least in a country that's been at war for that period of time. Both wars, of which you don't really see any present, are clear into it. So even if you're not interested in war and conflict, those things are very much interested in you. And you've lost people close to you, or people close to you have lost people close to them because of war. So we don't have a choice in being disinterested in war. And I'm going to argue in some degree we don't have a choice in being disinterested in genocidal conflict either. Second quote I think about when I see the slide comes from Winston Churchill, who once said, "The story of the human race is war." What I like about that quote is, imagine Dr. Goodman gave you an assignment to tell the story of history. Why we have the languages we have today, why we have the countries we have, the distribution of diseases, the distribution of physical characteristics. How did all these things come to be? But she says to you, in telling the story, you can only tell it from one perspective or one lens. What perspective or lens might give you the best understanding of it? I'm hard-pressed to suggest a better perspective than war. Again, even if you're not interested in it, even if you don't agree with it, war can give you a pretty clear picture of why our country exists the way it does today, how languages have been spread, how diseases have been spread. So again, it seems to be a central part of our existence, even if it's something we don't like acknowledging. The third quote I think of when I see this slide comes from Plato, Greek philosopher, who once said, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." What does he mean by that statement? Only the dead have seen the end of war. You're back from spring break, let's just get you started. What does he mean? Sean? A class this size, there's no one named Sean. Yes?
It means that there is no end to war. War is ongoing, and the only person who sees the end of it is a person that's no longer on earth.
Exactly right. There's no end to it. Again, try and get your mind around this. That if your great-great-great-grandparents came back today, so many things would be difficult for you to talk about with them. iPods, telephones, automobiles, even the structure of this room and this building, fashion, religion. But there's probably one thing you have with any generation of ancestor before you, and probably descendants after you, and that is the impact of war on their lives, or on people who they know. So again, when you think about the magnitude of this, you're not going to live, and I feel pretty comfortable making this statement. In your lifetime, you're not going to to see the end of war. We hope to see it in our country, but we're not going to see it worldwide. So I think in many ways, this makes this an incredibly important topic for us to be spending time on. When Plato says only the dead have seen the end of war, there's also some literal truth to that. Because war has been one of the greatest experiences of human loss and human suffering. We see in the 20th century 5 times the numbers of victims, 100 million, war-related deaths compared to the 19th century, 10 times the number of victims compared to the 18th century. Sometimes people see a slide like this and they think this only has to do with technology. That what has happened over the course of time is we've gotten better at killing large numbers of people. And there's truth to that. But if you partition out the effects of technology, you would still see this same type of steep upward trend because we've seen an increase in conflict over the centuries. In the 1980s, 1990s, that increase leveled out a little bit with the end of the Cold War, but since about 2001, that increase has started to tick up again. Pretty steep upward increase. So we don't live in a time of increasing peace. We don't live in a time of increasing harmony. We live in a time of increasing conflict and increasing war. And again, what worries you, if you work in genocide studies, is you work in a field that doesn't have an easy end to it. Because as long as populations continue to increase, which ours is, as long as resources become increasingly scarce, which ours are, those two things tend to lead to increased levels of conflict. And the more conflict we have, the greater the chance that some of that conflict will become genocidal. So let's talk about conflict in the context of genocide. And for most of you who have been in this course, this material on this slide will be pretty much reviewed to you. But let's talk a little bit about how we define genocide, because it's a pretty contentious issue, obviously, but for our purposes here today. I think it's easy to talk about genocide, or it's easiest to talk about genocide by contrasting it to quote-unquote ordinary warfare. In ordinary war, you typically have military combatants fighting other military combatants. In ordinary war, you typically have one nation-state or country fighting another nation-state or country. But both of those things, who is fighting who, from what locations, both of those things change in genocide. In genocide, you have military combatants typically fighting against civilians, and you typically have the state of one country, the group in power, fighting against its own citizens. When you have that situation, you have what most scholars would call genocide. Raoul Hilberg's a famous Holocaust historian describes it this way: that a group in power can decide there's another group of people living in their community that they no longer wish to live in their community. And they can put them in ghettos and isolate them, or, as what often happens, they can force them out of the country. But Hilberg says you take that statement, a group of people live in our community that we no longer wish to live in our community, and in genocide, you take off the final few words, and it becomes there's a group of people living in our community that we no longer wish to live, period. When a group in power makes that decision, they've made the decision to commit mass murder. They've committed what scholars would call genocide. We have had genocide as long as we've had human history. The Hebrew Scriptures, the Christian Old Testament, have several stories of people believing that God told them to wipe out another group of people in their entirety. And in some cases, they were fairly successful at that. Those are our earliest recorded cases of genocide. But in the 20th century, the 1900s, we got incredibly good, in a morally upside-down sense of the word. We got very good at genocide, at killing large numbers of people over an extended period of time, so good that scholars in the field typically call the 20th century the age of genocide. And we see some of the points here for that. The destruction of the native Southwest African people, the Guerreros, by German colonizers in 1904. This is in present-day Namibia. The murder of 1.5 million Armenians by Islamic Turks between 1915 and 1923. regardless of what else you take from today, one of the things I want you to really fully recognize are the generational impacts of genocide. Okay? In other words, genocide and its effects don't stop just because the killing stops. Here's a great example in Armenia. This is almost 100 years ago, this genocide. Every April 24th, Armenian communities around the world gather together to remember this genocide and to commemorate it. It's the Armenian community's equivalent of Yom HaShoah. It will happen April 24th in your community here, and I'm sure Dr. Goodman and other people can point you to those locations. It's important that Armenians remember this genocide because Turkey still denies it as a matter of official government policy. And every year, the sitting U.S. president on April 24th has to make a statement about the Armenian experience without using the word genocide. Because if he uses the word genocide, Turkey will be so upset by that they'll recall their ambassador, they will take our U.S. military bases in Turkey and expel them. And Turkey's an important strategic ally for us. Now, it was understood in all 8 years of Bush's presidency that when he spoke about the Armenian commemoration every April 24th, he never claimed to be called genocide. And he used every other word but that. Atrocities, human rights abuses, slaughters, massacres, deprivation, mass murder. And Turkey is fine with that, oddly enough. Just don't use the G word, genocide. President Bush never did. President Obama ran, one of his platforms was to say to the Armenian community, if I'm elected, I will call it what it was, genocide. Last April 24th, President Obama had a chance to do that and didn't do it. And Armenian communities around the country were devastated by the trust they had placed in him and called it what it was. President Obama's response was, it's politically a very difficult time right now for us to upset Turkey, but I've got at least 3 more April 24th. So when April 24th comes this year, Google Obama and see what the presidential statement is. Actually, it'll be available on April 23rd. I think most of us in the field think he's probably not going to use it this year either, but we are going to hold him to his commitment that at some point during his term, he will call this what it was, genocide. So here's a genocide that happened 100 years ago. Did its effect stop in 1923? Absolutely not. It's still today impacting political realities in an important part of the world. Implementation of Soviet man-made famine in the Ukraine in 32-33. In November of 2006, the Ukrainian parliament passed legislation calling these events under Stalin what they believed it to be, genocide. The Holocaust of 39 to 45, in which 6 million Jews, 2 out of every 3 of Europe's Jews lost their lives. And again, here's another illustration of the generational impact. You have a chance to hear from, and I think you already have this semester, children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, and you know there how the experience of the Holocaust for people who weren't even alive at the time, and maybe have never even been to Europe, how that experience still leaves that generational legacy. Mass killings and genocide in Indonesia, Bangladesh, Burundi, Cambodia, East Timor, Guatemala, Iraq, Rwanda, Bosnia-Herzegovina. Let me say a couple of things about the 2 on here that I know most well from my research, which are Rwanda and Bosnia-Herzegovina. In Rwanda, beginning in April of 1994, you start to get a sense that April is a pretty big month in genocide studies. We have a lot of commemorations and beginnings during this month. In April of 1994, over a 100-day period, 800,000 Rwandans, mostly some moderate Hutus, are killed by Hutu extremists. You can take any 100-day segment of the Holocaust, you don't find a rate of 800,000 dead. As Myrna mentioned, I teach 3 times a year at Auschwitz, government and military officials, in a week-and-a-half-long seminar about what genocide is, what the warning signs are, and what you can do to stand up and make a difference. We teach it on the grounds of Auschwitz. As we come in and the Auschwitz historians talk to us, and we walk the grounds of Auschwitz, At its peak, Auschwitz could never imagine 800,000 people in a 100-day period. Not to lessen at all the horrors of Auschwitz, but to put it in perspective the frenzy of killing that occurred in Rwanda in 100 days. Not by just military, not by simply militia, but by neighbors killing neighbors. And the hard work of killing. Ammunition was very seldom used in Rwanda. It was machete. It was masu. Baseball clubs with nails or spikes driven through the end. When I interviewed Rwandan perpetrators and asked them what they remember 10 years after the fact about the genocide and the perpetration, almost always one of the first things they mention is exhaustion. They remember being physically exhausted because of the toll that killing took. Okay? We are 16 years past the Rwandan genocide. What's the generational impact? Let me give you 2 examples. It's estimated that over 9 out of every 10 children living in Rwanda in 1994 saw murder. Didn't read about it, didn't hear about it. They saw someone hacked to death, beat to death, clubbed to death, kicked to death in front of their eyes. How does a society rebuild? And this is what Rwanda struck. How does a society rebuild when over 9 out of every 10 of its children have seen that? Our children in this country suffer significant traumas from a wide variety of perspectives. But we don't have over 9 out of every 10 of our children seeing murder firsthand in a 100-day period and trying to rebuild from that. 70% of women in Rwanda were raped during the 1994 genocide. I've spoken at an event in Rwanda where I used this 800,000 figure in 100 days, which scholars recognize as an appropriate number for the death toll. And I had a very angry woman get up in the back of the room and in the middle of the time and say, that underestimates it. The death toll still continues. And she's exactly right. What she's saying is 70% of women in Rwanda raped in 1994, a good number of them have contracted HIV/AIDS. And because of that, 16 years later, people are still dying from the genocide in 1994. You see the impact of it. When you visit villages in Rwanda, they will speak of women who come into the village as beggars and can only stay for a couple of days before they have to go elsewhere because the women reek. The women are full of stench. The stench and the reeking comes from the fact that they were raped so often, so repeatedly, so brutally, that internally the damage has been so severe that these women suffer from what's called a urogenital fistula, which means the internal organs are so disrupted that urine and feces can no longer be held inside, and actually for many of the women, urine and feces now come out through the vagina because of all the internal damage they suffered during the genocide. You smell these women before you see them. They go from village to village to village. They can be fixed, medically speaking, physically speaking, with a fairly straightforward medical surgery that's also unfortunately very costly. And it's difficult for people in Rwanda to get. But you see how emotionally a country like this, you have to ask the question, can it ever be fixed? Can it ever repair itself? Can it ever recover from what it inflicted on itself 16 years before? Bosnia-Herzegovina is another example. These pictures you see here, a little difficult to see, but in July of 2007, I was with a group called the International Commission on Missing Persons, which works in Iraq, Argentina, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I was volunteering time in Bosnia, and this group works to find the bodies of missing persons and to use DNA analysis to reconnect them with living family members. This is a field outside of a small village called Srebrenica, where 8,000 Muslim young boys were assassinated in 1995 by Bosnian Serbs. 2 young boys had been playing in this field, soccer, went to kick a ball. With the ball came up a turf, a divot of ground, and in that piece of turf was a bone fragment. 10 years before, people will look at this bone fragment and said, it's just a piece of a pig. Bosnia and Herzegovina, about 450 mass graves have been dug out. And when you dig them up, you find human remains, anywhere from 5 to about 500 in the largest mass grave. This was a mass grave we were called to in Buda. And for 2 weeks, I worked in this grave, just exhuming the grave, just digging it out. And this was a secondary mass grave, which means that these were Muslims, Bosniaks, killed elsewhere, buried elsewhere, and then dug out because the Bosnian Serbs thought they were buried into a place too easy to find, and they were reburied elsewhere. But they were dug out by bulldozer, by backhoe, and just shovels of dirt thrown in the backs of trucks, and trucks in different directions. There are tertiary graves. There are fourth-order graves in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In this mass grave, we found the remains of about 50 victims. No complete skeletons, because it was a secondary mass grave. You just simply found partial skeletons of about 50 victims. The first 2 days on this exhumation, a Muslim woman sat on the edge of a grave, pouring rain, mud, on her knees, just rocking back and forth and praying and wailing. And you heard her tell that someone's heart can break. But she never really, I mean, obviously it doesn't literally happen. But in listening to this woman for this 2 days, it was the closest I've ever heard of someone's heart actually breaking. I mean, that's how it sounded. Out of respect to her, because I don't know the language at all, I didn't say anything to her. Other people would occasionally say things to her, but eventually her story came out. And her story was that she had lost a father, a grandfather, 2 brothers, and 3 sons in the genocide of Srebrenica. Her youngest son was 12 years old. He had already been found in 3 other graves, parts of him. Each time, someone had come to her door and knocked to say that they had found a piece of her son. And she had to grieve. This is 12 years after the killing. She's on the edge of this grave just praying that they're not going to find her son in this grave, because she doesn't think her heart and soul can take it again. Understand that the impact of the genocide of 1995 for her is probably never going to be over. People who lived through genocide tell us again and again about those long-term impacts. So as you become kind of a scholar, which you're doing, you're becoming a student scholar in genocide studies, it's easy to kind of frame these off like I've done here. The genocide went from 75 to 79, 39 to 45. But in a way, that's not very respectful of the people who suffered in the genocide and the family members, because the impacts of these genocides just continue on from generation to generation to generation. So the general principle that I work from when I study these genocides from the 20th century, and again, if we look back a slide at all those genocides I mentioned to you, and you ask the question, how many people are we talking about in terms of numbers of dead? A pretty conservative estimate is about 60 million. 60 million. 60. I did that. That one made sense to me. It's completely backwards to you. But 60 million victims in the 20th century. Again, you're kind of hard-pressed to find a problem that humans inflict on each other that takes that type of toll in 1 century. So one of the principles I work from is this, that it seems to be, historically, when a political, social, or religious group comes to power and they want to commit genocide, they do. There are a lot of other things they have to worry about, but one of the things they don't have to worry about are finding the people to carry out the killing. Now, again, think about this for a few moments. If you come to power as a group and you want to commit genocide, there are things you do have to overcome. You have to worry about resistance from the victim group. I think for decades after the Holocaust, because we didn't ask the question, we thought that Jews never resisted. But when we started to ask the question, we saw that yes, the victim group resisted with everything they could given the situation. You have to worry about resistance from other people in your community who are going to stand up and say, it doesn't matter to me what you care about that group of people, you can't kill them. You can't execute them in this way. You may have to worry about resistance from the world, although between you and I, don't let leave this room, if you want to commit genocide, you'll be able to But here's the one thing you don't have to worry about if you want to commit genocide. You don't have to worry about finding killers. Isn't that an incredible world to live in? I'd love to live in a world that a group comes to power and wants to commit mass murder, but at some point has to throw their hands up and say, as much as we want to commit genocide, we just can't find the people to do it. We don't live in that world. In the world we inhabit, genocidal regimes find genocidal killers. And again, it's easy for you to look at this or listen to it and say, well, that's because the military commits genocide and military people have to do what they're told. Well, obviously that's a pretty simplistic understanding of how the military works, but it's also an inaccurate understanding of how genocide works. Not all genocides have huge military components. A lot of genocides have paramilitary components. A lot of genocides have neighbor components, of neighbors killing neighbors in the context of the violence. So again, what we have to get our head around is this recognition that, if a group comes to power and wants to commit genocide, they don't have to worry about who's going to carry that out. So the research questions for me are kind of twofold. One is, how many people does it take to carry out genocide and mass killing? Now, when I ask this question, I'm not asking about the architects. Okay, so when people hear that I do work in perpetrator behavior, I actually do this request fairly often. Will you come speak about Hitler, or you write a chapter about Hitler? I can almost guarantee you that most everyone in this room knows more about Hitler than I know. It's not my interest, never been a course of study, it's not the area I focus on. It doesn't minimize his role in the Holocaust. Tons of scholars have focused on those architects of genocide, but it's not in my interest. I'm also not interested in the mid-level bureaucrats. In the Holocaust, a figure like Adolf Eichmann, who kept the trains running to Auschwitz on the appointed time, full of human cargo, as he would put it. What I'm interested in are the rank and file perpetrators, the men, and we see more and more often the women, at the front lines of genocidal violence. Now, these are the ones we know the least about. If you think about it, who do we go after when cases of genocide are over? We go after Milosevic. We go after the leaders. We go after the architects. We go after the people who were visible leadership figures, and we should. But by and large, the people who kill, and you see two examples here in these slides, one from the Einsatzgruppen urban activities of 41, 42 in Eastern Europe and Russia, over 1.5 million, 1.25 million Jews killed in this time period, really just as you see here on this slide, being executed with shots in the back of the neck. That's a low-level rank and file perpetrator. Here you see perpetrators in Rwanda, young boys part of the Interahamwe, groups of young boys that just roam the streets of Kigali and rural villages and kill with whatever they had. Shovels, hoes, spades, machete, masu. These people who actually literally bloody their hands in killing, we don't know that much about. Certainly for the past 10 years we haven't known that much about. So the estimates of how many people are going to be kind of hard to figure. In the Holocaust, we estimate maybe as many as 500,000 people, Germans, Ukrainians, Croats, Poles, at the front lines of killing, who literally bloodied their hands in killing. Rwanda, we have a bit better estimate, about 250,000 people in Rwanda who were involved in the killing process. And I think that's a pretty precise demographic estimate of the number of perpetrators in Rwanda. Bosnia-Herzegovina, the number of Bosnian Serbs involved in atrocities, war crimes, genocide against Muslims, Bosniaks, probably 15 to 25,000. Regardless of where we put the actual numbers, the short of it is, it takes an awful lot of people to commit mass murder at the front lines, the people who actually carry out the killing. The second question then is, who are these people? Where do these people come from, and how are they enlisted to do this? I mean, what type of people become capable of committing these genocidal activities? You've read about some of them in this class. You've seen it on film. You've discussed it amongst yourselves. What type of people actually come to carry out these types of atrocities? And again, what's fascinating about this question is that by and large, after the genocide is over, these people step back into their original life, and they become pretty much who they were before. They become the teachers, the lawyers, the religious figures in some cases, the criminals in some cases, the husbands, the fathers, the sons. They step back into whatever they were before this started, and by and large, tend to escape prosecution of any type. So I think it's an important question, who they are and how it comes about. Now, other people have asked this question before me. I've not been, obviously if I was pleased with their answers, I wouldn't have felt the need to write about it or speak about it as much as I do, but other people have certainly asked the question, and some of the responses for the origins of this type of evil, I think have kind of been instructive. One response has been that the origins of evil are in the nature of the collective. That there's something about the group that always brings out the worst in people. Okay? You just returned from spring break. Maybe some of you saw this dynamic. Groups of people get together, it gets pretty nasty. I should say to groups, I have 3 children. Those children have sleepovers. I've seen firsthand the way that groups can turn. People are tired, they run out of food. So sometimes groups do bad things. But to say that groups always run toward evil is certainly, I think, an oversimplification, and if anything, exaggeration as well. Groups of people have done incredible good in this world. They've brought democracies to countries that perhaps labored under totalitarian regimes. Groups of people lie at the heart of some of our most caring social institutions. I think what social psychologists tell us is that when groups come together, they exacerbate or heighten the tendencies of people within them. You bring together a group of 10 pretty nasty people, they may be capable of some pretty terrible group nastiness. But you bring together a group of 10 good people, and they can be capable, you've been part of some of these groups, they can be capable of incredible goodness as well. So group dynamics are important. I mean, that's my training, that's my doctoral work is in group dynamics. I know it's important, but I'm very hesitant to say that when groups come together, it always runs bad. I don't think that's true at all. Secondly, is that there's something about ideology. Ideology is what you believe. It's your worldview, it's your belief system. Is ideology important in understanding perpetrators? Absolutely so. Is it the only thing of importance? I'd say absolutely not. Ideologies are very seldom consistent. And perpetrators don't hold ideologies consistently across the population pool either. So for some perpetrators, ideology about Tutsis and Hutu superiority could have been important. For most perpetrators in Rwanda, ideology just didn't matter that much. It was opportunity. It was greed. It was a chance to have a radio that you didn't have. To have a cow or a home that you didn't have. So ideology is important, but again, I want to make sure that we put it in place. And then finally, this is one most people jump to, is the people who perpetrate genocide have to be pathological, mentally ill, or they have to have some twisted personality. This was, for me, the hardest chapter in the book to write, because there's a ton of research you have to unpack about the search for the personality behind perpetrators. So to make a very long, complicated story short and accessible, for all that we've looked for it, we've yet to find significant levels of pathology among perpetrators. We didn't see it in the Holocaust. We haven't seen it in Rwanda. And early studies in Bosnia and Herzegovina suggest we're not going to see it there either. That if anything, we think the general rate of mental illness, which is about 10% in the population, if anything among perpetrators, you can make the argument that that rate would be lower among perpetrator populations rather than higher. Twisted personality. Again, for all that we've looked for, the personality that explains perpetrators, we've yet to find it. But now what I want you to see on this slide is worry less about the details of it and more about why do we want there to be extraordinary causes of extraordinary evil. That's a natural tendency. We see something extraordinary and our mind wants to think the cause of be extraordinary. That's just a natural cognitive tendency. But why does it mean so much to us that the extraordinary evil perpetrated in genocide has to be committed by people who are extraordinary in some way? Why does that mean so much to us to want to believe that? Yeah. Exactly right. We don't want to think we're capable of being as evil. We love talking about the evil of perpetrators as long as we're talking about them. Okay? Someone incredibly different from us. Someone who's pathological, a different personality, a different culture, a different place in history. All of that's fine. But when we have to look at ourselves and ask the questions of could we ever be in a situation where we would be capable of perpetrating something like this, that's not a question we want to ask. But in many ways, that's why I'm asking you here to ask today with me, is to try to come to this understanding of how it is that ordinary people like you and I commit this type of extraordinary evil. And again, this is the simple argument in my book, is that most perpetrators very much have been like you and I, and the challenge for us is, how did over time they move from sitting in a college classroom, did they become involved and make choices of their own active will to start down a path that 6 years later has them at the gates of Auschwitz as a guard and the most notorious of the 6 Nazi death camps in the East. That person didn't just show up on Tuesday to claim that job. He came from somewhere before. And where he came from before was probably a place and a situation and a family very much like the places, situations, and families that we have. Okay? Now, most people never do what he did. But somehow, he finds his way to committing these atrocities. And what I want to ask is, how does that happen? And this is an important question, again, for you and I to wrestle with. It's a question about human nature. You're in the process of becoming an educated people. Being an educated person means that you hold truth in esteem. You value truth. That all is great until you also realize that sometimes because you value truth, you're going to be faced with a truth that doesn't make you feel good about who you are. It doesn't make you feel good about the world you live in. But if you value truth, you've still got to find a way to get your mind and your heart around that truth that is ugly, that doesn't make you feel good about who you are and who's sitting next to you, and somehow get your heart and your head and your mind around that truth and take from it something that can enhance your self-understanding. And to me, that's really, it's nice when people read the book and they kind of quibble with the details and chew on the details of how it happens. But really the key learning piece for me is, can you look at yourself and understand the ways in which you could be subject to these forces as well? Not to excuse perpetrators by any sense, and we're going to finish up with that in a few moments, but for you to understand the capacities of human nature. Survivors of genocide tell us about what people get through and the resilience of human nature. Resistors and rescuers tell us about the incredible goodness of human nature and the heights of human nature. Perpetrators tell us about the depths of human nature. And just because it's an ugly truth doesn't mean that you can ignore this and just want to study good and just want to study resilience. I mean, all of this, I think, is part of genocide studies. There's a quote here from T.H. Huxley, who was famously known as Darwin's bulldog. Charles Darwin, as he wrote Evolutionary Theory, for a variety of personal reasons, was pretty hesitant to publicize it, and he knew everything about it. He was the author of Evolutionary Theory, as you know, but he just didn't like to speak about it. Huxley was a friend of his who was the exact opposite. He hardly knew anything about evolutionary theory, but he loved talking about it to everyone he met. And so he was known as Darwin's bulldog. But Huxley does say this quote, I think is interesting, in 1860. "My business is to teach my aspirations to conform themselves to fact, not to try and make facts harmonize with my aspirations." And I actually have this little card above my desk. This is a good reminder for me. I have a way that I wish the world would work. this field, I have to look at how it seems the world works and then bring my aspirations in line with that. And I think this is the challenge of working, certainly with perpetrator behavior. So this is how I tried. Have you read this one?
Yes,
Process
that was
reading?
the reading for this week.
Reading for this week, okay. So none of you have read this yet. So this is what I try to do, is say, let's understand this, the making of a perpetrator as a process, not as an event, okay? And again, we'll go back to Darwin's example. Darwin's time, people understood creation of species and creation of the world as an event that God did at one time. Darwin's great challenge to his time period was to say, no, the world and species aren't an event, they're a process that has unfolded over hundreds and thousands of years. I think of perpetrators in that way. Are there perpetrators who seem to have been born to perpetrate this type of evil and enjoy doing it and be ready to do it? Absolutely. Are they typical? No. Do they make up the majority of perpetrators? I'd argue not. The majority of perpetrators have found their way from a quote-unquote normal life down a path that's led them to commit the type of atrocities that we see in genocide and mass killing. So my question as a researcher is, what is that influence that? And we're not going to go in great detail in this model, but just broadly, what I've looked at are the cultural constructions of worldview. What are the values of a society that may make it not a society of perpetrators, but a society capable of producing perpetrators? And let me give you one example. In Rwanda, when you interview alleged and convicted perpetrators, and you work through a translator, at least one, if not two translators, from Rwanda to French to English, and you ask the question, why didn't you disobey authority? Why didn't you just say, no, I'm not going to kill? The question itself doesn't even translate. Because in Rwanda, the cultural orientation is so authority dominant, like it was in Germany in the 30s and 40s, like it was in Cambodia in the 70s, so authority dominant that the notion in Rwandan society that a superior would ask you to do one thing or tell you to do something and that you would disobey is a foreign notion. And you see it on their faces as they're trying to unscrew the question and figure out how to give you a response. It's like asking, why did you stop breathing at some point and do something else? It's just, well, this is the culture. It's kind of embedded. It's how it works. I'll leave here tomorrow, and one of the things I do for the Auschwitz Institute is occasionally deliver briefings to the CIA and the U.S. Department of State on genocide warning areas. And so we have a meeting in D.C. on Thursday and Friday. I think the title of it is Confronting and Countering Atrocities in Africa. But one of the big things we'll talk about in the meeting at the briefing will be, what is it about African culture and society and history, all of it touched by colonialism, that leads African culture to have these fairly dominant, social dominance hierarchies and structures, so that when a madman comes to power, the least of his worries is getting people to follow, because people are used to following. So a large part of what we'll do at the briefing is to understand and unpack what is it about African culture that's important for us to understand when we recognize the ongoing atrocities in Congo and Rwanda and Burundi and Sierra Leone and other places. Psychological construction of the other is another piece of the model. Again, here I'm very interested in how perpetrators come to view their victims. Okay? How do they come to think it's okay to do what they do to their victims? I still remember one perpetrator testimony I read in Germany of a Holocaust perpetrator where he's asked by the attorney, the prosecutor at trial, how did you come to think it was right to kill Jews? And his response, and most trial testimonies you read are just dry and boring, you don't know what to get from them. This response is incredible. His response was, it's not that I thought it was right to kill them, I thought it was wrong if I didn't kill them. You notice the difference there? They're so far out there. I mean, is my universe of moral commitment. And anyone in this universe, I feel an obligation to be kind to. Jews are so far outside of that circle of commitment, it's not just right to kill them, it's actually wrong if I don't kill them. I'm doing something wrong if I let them live, because they are that much of a threat to the racial purity of my country and of my people. So how is it that perpetrators come to see the victims in such a way that the perpetration is justified? There's no moral problem. And I get asked this question, how do perpetrators get over the moral anxiety of what they do? Typically, there's no moral anxiety because they've settled that by placing the perpetrators, the victims, so far outside of the universal moral commitment that whatever you do to them is justified. The U.S. cavalrymen in the 1800s, in some of the Indian wars, killed women, raped and killed women, and then cut out their vagina, and took the vagina and stuffed it upside down on a saddle horn as a trophy. How does one human come to think of another human in such a way that you could take that intimate physical reality and make it into a trophy? When the same soldiers studied the testicles of male victims in the Indian wars, dumped them out and sewed them together to use as tobacco pouches and sent home as gifts, how do victims become so far outside the universe of moral obligation that the perpetrator doesn't even think twice about using the victim's body parts in that way? And this is the tricky thing about working in perpetrator behavior. In some ways, you have to step into their world to start to understand how they view the victim. And it's their view of the victim that I think is essential to understanding how they come to do what they do. And the final piece of it is recognizing that genocide occurs with groups of people killing other people in large numbers over an extended period of time. So we'll go back to group dynamics. What are the group dynamics in a collection of perpetrators that are at play? What is your first name? Drew? Drew and I are in a group. We're in the Interahamwe in Rwanda. We're perpetrating genocide in large numbers of people. The group dynamics that Drew and I face there are pretty similar in how they work to the group dynamics that he and I will face here as members of Sonoma State's tennis team, let's say. You play tennis? Oh, good. I don't either, but maybe it's But, so we're on the tennis team. We want to be good in that group, and we want to be recognized for our skills and abilities in that group. And you're all okay with that because that's a good group. It's a tennis team. We can't fall for the lie that a group of perpetrators works differently than a group in a so-called good group. The group dynamics here at play in our group of perpetrators in Interahamwe are the same. We want to be good at what we do. If we're killing, we want to be the most creative. We want to be the most brutal. We want to have the most notches on our belt or our gun or our machete or our masu. We want to be recognized within this group for being good at what we do. We're in a group that's a brotherhood. This group is close. We've lost our fathers probably. We probably come from broken homes, and Interahamwe is our first home. This is the scary thing when you interview perpetrators in Rwanda, is they've been in prison in some cases 10 years, but you ask them about life in the Interahamwe, and you see the twinkle in the eye, and you see the half smile, and they miss it. It was family. And you worry for a country when these perpetrators, and this is happening, come out of prison and run back to find that connection in the group. And we have these groups of Interahamwes now in Congo, committing atrocities in Congo, that have served their time in Rwanda, but have gone back to find that connection. So all the things that are important in groups, social group identification, binding factors, conformity, peer pressure, all of these things are going to work as well in a group of perpetrators. There's nothing unique about them simply because they're doing something incredibly evil doesn't somehow make them different from the other type of group dynamics we see elsewhere. So when we look at this, I think in conclusion, why are these questions important for us? One reason is, as I said before, the age of genocide, unfortunately, is not over. In the 20th century, 60 million victims. In the 21st century, we've had genocide in Darfur, I think arguably from February 2003, ongoing in some respects. Part of what I do with the Auschwitz Institute is in addition to teaching at Auschwitz 3 times a year, I do these briefings where I keep track with other scholars from around the world about hotspots where we're worried about genocide around the world where we're concerned about the potential for genocidal violence. These 11 hotspots are all what we classify as high risk. We have about 20 medium risk and about a dozen low risk. This is just high risk. So when people say that genocide is only about the Holocaust, they're not only ignoring the past 50 years of the 20th century, but they're ignoring the first decade of the 21st century as well. So if we look at these countries for a moment, Zimbabwe, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda. Rwanda's heartbreaking. How many of you saw what's at Rwanda? At the end of it, you feel like the good guys win, it should be over. The good guys in Rwanda have kind of become the bad guys now. The Tutsis, who stopped the genocide in '94, the victim group, Tutsi rebels stopped it. Their rebel leader, Paul Kagame, is now the president of Rwanda. Tutsis make up 15% of the population. Hutus make up 85%. Are the Tutsis ever going to allow that to be a fully functioning democracy? They'd be silly to, right? You're going to be outvoted 85 to 15. I mean, it's probably not going to happen. Kagame's regime is pretty repressive. You can get on Google, and I believe it was about a month ago, Christine Amanpour had a sit-down interview with Paul Kagame. And at the end of the interview, the first 2 or 3 minutes, you just thought, it's just a soft interview, she just throwing in the softball questions. And then out of nowhere, she just starts launching in with the human rights abuses that the world has heard about, and Kagame starts backpedaling pretty quickly. But it's a fascinating, I think it's only about 14 minutes, a fascinating interview with Rwanda's president. And as you hear it, and you kind of listen between the lines of it and hear the subtext, you recognize that Rwanda, there's a reason. It's a high-risk country. It's a minority population trying to hold power over the majority population, and they're going to have to do that with some pretty repressive measures. Sudan, we've mentioned Algeria, Bosnia, Kosovo, Chechnya, Iraq, Pakistan, Burma, which the military regime in power in Burma refers to as Myanmar. Burma is the highest of all of these countries. Every risk factor, Burma is off the scales on. I think people in the field are surprised when they wake up every morning and genocide hasn't happened in Burma. It's going to take a significant either internal coup, revolution, or external intervention to take Burma away from the precipice of genocide. The question right now isn't if genocide will happen in Burma, it's really when. That's one of the 11 hotspots that right now, if any of these 11 tomorrow someone said genocidal violence is flared out, it'd be hard to say you'd be surprised about it. So this is kind of the reason for taking a class like this, the reason for asking the questions we've asked today is the urgency of the fact that we live in a world that's not learning from the genocidal past. If anything, what we've learned is genocide seems to work for perpetrators. And we certainly don't have anything in place that seems to stop them, want to stop them from perpetrating. And finally, and we'll take questions, I've always wanted to be clear that when I talk about this material, I'm never trying to excuse perpetrators. What I want to do is explain and understand how people come to do this evil, because if we can't understand it, we can never hope to unpack it, to rehabilitate perpetrators. We can never hope to stop perpetrators. So when we read the book or we have these class discussions, simply because we understand something doesn't mean we're saying that thing is right or it's somehow forgivable. We understand it, but we still hold the ability to say this behavior is morally and legally egregious, and people have to be held responsible for it. But again, it seems to me here kind of a mistake you could make would be, and I say this hesitantly, because a wonderful heroic figure in understand it. But I can't respect the notion that none of us should do it. Because if we're not going to be in the business of figuring out how these people come to be, we really have no hopes of trying to stop them. And this is a large part of what we do at the Institute. We bring 20 government officials from around the world to Auschwitz, and for a week and a half, we teach them what genocide is, what the warning signs are, what they can do to stop it. And when I teach them about perpetrators of genocide, I'm not thinking they're going to leave there and go back and know how to make perpetrators, but I'm understanding they're going to leave there and they'll know some of the warning signs. And they'll know how to unmake perpetrators or stop perpetrators from being made. We can only do that if we understand the mechanics of what lies behind it. If we're just going to run away and say it's too horrible for us to study, we have no hope of ever stopping it. So a large part, again, I think as you're in this class, you're hoping to get the type of information that allows you to move from being a bystander in these cases to being an upstander and to put yourself in positions and take advantage of your voice to make a decision. You're going to hear later, John's not here yet, is he, Myrna? John Roth?
No, he'll be here in May.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, I think I woke Myrna. But, John Roth is coming. And when John Roth comes, don't tell him I already stole his thunder on this, but John will talk about leverage and responsibility. And he'll tell you that you all have leverage. I don't care what year you are in school, where you work, what your major is, what you're thinking about doing, what your parents did, you have leverage in your life to make a difference. When you take a class like this, with that leverage, now comes responsibility. You're not ignorant any longer. And your responsibility is to use whatever leverage you have. If it's 1 people, if it's 2 people, if it's 400 people, to make a difference. Social contagion, and I'll finish with this, is a theory in psychology that says within 3 degrees of us, okay, the number of people to whom our opinions matter, not just the number of people who would say, well, I know X and you know Y and we know each other, but the number of people to whom our opinions matter runs around 1,000. And you may not believe that, but you probably do have about 1,000 people in your life that when you say something would at least give you a listen, would at least give you a voice to some degree. And again, I think part of the challenge of being in a course like this is recognizing you've got that leverage and you also now have that responsibility. And it's a large part of what we try to put on government officials who come to spend time with us at Auschwitz as well. Time for questions, comments from you. Yes?
What made the difference in South Africa?
Huh?
How does South Africa relate to genocide?
That's a great question. Why did South Africa not become genocidal? Apartheid was certainly a human rights nightmare and an abusive system. It never became genocidal. It probably had some historical reasons there, but I think what's been interesting is with the shift now of the victim group in apartheid now holding significant leadership, what has been substantial about that so that there's not been retaliation? And so retaliation killings are one of the issues in Rwanda. And I think in South Africa, 2 of the things that have been instructive, one has been the strong force of personality of Nelson Mandela. I mean, that's been huge. And that's hard to replicate somewhere else. And the other has been the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has been huge, but people, and this happened in Rwanda, people tried to take the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and said, it worked great in South Africa, let's put it to use in, because after all, it's all in Africa. Well, the problems were, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, scholars will tell you, didn't work as well as the world thinks it worked in South Africa. It had and still has some huge problems. And secondly, Rwanda is just a very different culture than South Africa. It does not have a large Afrikaner white population like South Africa has had. And what worked well here has not worked well at all in Rwanda. So this is one of the issues. And as you think about comparing genocides, this is intriguing. In the Holocaust, the victim group, when the killing was over, the Jews fled to the United States, Canada, to Great Britain, and to the new state of Israel. Jews and perpetrators, victims and perpetrators in the Holocaust, very seldom had to live together physically again. Rwanda, Bosnia and Herzegovina, that's completely different. groups in Rwanda can't flee anywhere. They have to come back to Rwanda and literally live next door to the people who try to exterminate them. Bosnia-Herzegovina, kind of the same. Bosnian Muslims having to come back and figure out how to live with Bosnian Serbs and Bosnian Croats. And those issues of reconciliation become, these are very different issues than Jews and Germans have to deal with after the Holocaust. Other questions? Yes?
Have there been any studies of the societal or interpersonality differences between perpetrators and resistors and people who try to help?
No, I mean, yes, there have been, but we don't have conclusive answers. The question was, are there any personality differences or situation differences between people who help and people who perpetrate? And we want to think that education should make a difference, that religion should make a difference, that high moral values should make a difference, and on, but we don't really see many of those factors having what psychologists would call predictive value. For every perpetrator you find that had a wonderful religious upbringing, and that brought him or her to be a rescuer of some type, you'll find easily a perpetrator who had a wonderful religious upbringing and killed in the name of Christ. Bosnian Serbs, one of the Bosnian Serbs I interviewed, not the first one, the second, spoke of the night before going to kill Muslims, being at his church, and being blessed by a priest for what he was about to do in the name of Christ. So, it would be so easy if we knew that these personality factors are doing these things to people as a child, make them good, and these things push them in another direction. But we just haven't seen those psycho-predictive capabilities in the studies. Yes?
From like your interviews for after the genocide, did you find that any of the perpetrators had any kind of remorse, like afterwards?
Yeah, that's a good question because, and this is where it's difficult, and I think when you work in perpetrator behavior, and you have this tendency as well, you think, well, the key piece of information you'll get will be from the perpetrator himself or herself. In truth, that's probably the least helpful information you get because there's such a self-presentation strategy of, even if they're not educated, they know they're supposed to be remorseful. They know they're supposed to feel badly. They're hoping it will get them off to some degree in terms of legal sentencing. So usually what I get more is from people who surrounded perpetrators and seen their behavior. And I think, when we talk about this mental gymnastic of placing victims out here so they're not part of your group and you can do whatever you want to them, you don't turn that around overnight. I mean, there's not an easy shift there. So for instance, I'm thinking of one Holocaust perpetrator testimony who was asked a question, and he's talking about what he did in the Holocaust, and at some point he says, and this is like 30 years after the fact, mid-1970s, his statement is something along the lines of, but the Jews were trying to take over the world, and they did have it coming, and you see what they're doing today in Israel. I mean, those decades of in his mind, learning what Jews were and the anti-Semitic prejudices that went with it, you don't undo those. So I think that question of remorse is always difficult. As a matter of fact, the courts have even decided that shows of remorse by perpetrators in Rwanda actually stop the proceedings. They won't allow it to go on because they're so suspicious of what the remorse means. There are perpetrators, you have some stories of perpetrators who have been rehabilitated and are now involved in reconciliation efforts. I know perpetrators in Rwanda, Hutus, who have adopted Tutsi children from families where they killed the child's parents and have gone back and adopted the child. I mean, these are very isolated cases. So I'm sure that you have those, but again, as a social psychologist, you're kind of interested more in the pattern of responding, or what did most respondents do. And I think in most cases, the remorse is more a remorse about the world doesn't understand what a threat the Tutsi were. The world doesn't understand what the Jews are trying to do, and if they only understood, they'd understand why I did what I did. Yes?
So, how do we interfere in order to prevent a possible genocide, especially with like the hotspot?
know in this room knows about it. Oprah knows about it. I mean, it's become kind of a celebrity cause. Now, that awareness is incredibly important. So again, this is that leverage piece, whether it's a dorm, whether it's a sorority, a fraternity, a workplace, a school, your state. I mean, just continuing to push that awareness. But I think the other piece is just recognizing the voice you have in shaping political will. And this is important. Maybe this is a good thing for us to finish on here. I want to respect your time, but we have to recognize that the people we've elected, the local, state, federal offices, they are, at least have some allegiance to hearing our voices and representing our interests. And here's the sad truth, is that of all things politicians in this country worry about when they go to sleep, about losing votes and losing re-election, they worry about voting the wrong way on health care, going the wrong way on Social Security, voting the wrong way on parks, on marijuana use, legalization, all the things they worry about. I'm pretty comfortable in saying there's not a politician in this country who goes to bed at night worrying that because they haven't taken a stand on Darfur, they're going to lose votes. Our job is to make them worry about that. And that is what every single one of us can do. And it's simple. I mean, you don't have to you just do it online easily. But the more that we can have a voice that says, even though our government thinks Darfur doesn't matter because it has no economic interest, no political interest, no strategic value to us, it has a human value to us. And because of that, something has to be done to stop the killing. Our politicians, and I don't hold them responsible here, I hold us responsible. This isn't costly for our politicians because we haven't made it costly. And I think a large part of what we're called to do in democracy is make our politicians understand that you will lose if these things are not represented, if you don't have a voice here. And I know that sounds very Pollyannish, and you probably want something more concrete and specific you can do right now. But at the end of the day, those are the types of changes that I think our national political will responds to, and international political will responds to as well. And some of it is us taking more active leadership in the United Nations, trying to restructure how the UN works. Nothing prohibits the UN from redefining genocide to make it more likely for them to intervene. But no one's pushing the UN to do that. And again, it's part of what we do at the Institute. We meet with the UN twice a year, and we ask them, can you redefine genocide? Can you get a rapid response strike force? Can you rework the Security Council structure, the decision making? I don't know if any of those things are going to happen in my lifetime, but I know that I want to spend a large part of my life trying to push those and agitate for those things to happen. And all of you have a voice and possibility of doing that as well. I want to make sure to respect your time. Should we call it?
Any more questions? Okay, well, we have. Oh,
I'm just curious, your instances of genocide, what percentage of those are religious-based or coming from religions?
Yeah, the question was what percentage of genocides are religious based? I don't know off the top of my head. I know the next project I'm working on is the role of the Christian church in the Holocaust in Rwanda and Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Christian church was a central part of those cultures when genocide happened. Yet the Christian church did relatively little to stand up in the face of genocide. I want to ask questions about why, as an institution, the church didn't do that. I have to go back and tease those percentages out and how you define something like Darfur is a good example. Darfur has a religious component to it. The north is Arab, is Islamic, the south is Christian tribal, but it also has an ethnic component. The north is Arab, the south is Native African. So some of them may be hard to tease out. I know it hasn't, you can say, a half or two-thirds, but religion's been a central way that we've defined who's us and who's them. And in that way, it's been used, whether it's war, genocide, and mass killing, it's certainly had a shared use of history, absolutely. All right, well, thank you very much.
Genocide.org. That is one way that you can do the genocide walk. Coming up, Sunday, where are people meeting? At Congregation Shomrei Torah in Santa Rosa. You can look it up, make your own sign. But first go to walktoendgenocide.org. Okay.
Is Veronica here? Maybe she could talk to anybody who's interested who hasn't
Veronica?
signed up yet.
Could you come forward and you can talk to somebody, people who haven't signed up yet?